Welcome to Philosophy and Critical Thinking, the Basics. In our last video, we discussed two fallacies, circular reasoning and begging the question. In this video, we're going to be talking about what is called conditional reasoning. Conditional reasoning is when we use a premise which is called a conditional. A conditional is when we say, if something is the case, then something else has to be the case. We'll have to be careful here that when we say if something is the case, then something else is the case, we're not saying that's probably the case or even possibly the case. We're saying it has to be the case. So let's look at the argument here. If there is a fire, then the alarm will sound. There is a fire, therefore the alarm will sound. So when checking to see whether this argument is valid, we're saying if there is a fire, then the alarm will sound, and we're saying that there is a fire. So if it's the case that if there's a fire, then it has to be the case that the alarm will sound, and there indeed is a fire, then it has to be the case that the alarm will sound. If you can imagine any situation where the alarm will not sound, then the premise, if there is a fire, then the alarm will sound, is false. So this is a valid argument. The technical term for this kind of argument is called Modus Ponens. So when we put Modus Ponens into logical form, this is what philosophers typically use. If P, then Q. P, therefore Q. And as we've spoken about before, when we put arguments into logical form, you can put any category or any situation into those letters, similar to algebra. So this is always a valid argument when we look at this, because we're saying if P is the case, then Q has to be the case. P is the case, therefore Q has to be the case. So this is always valid. So when you're looking at arguments of a particular style, and you see and you recognize the Modus Ponens style, you'll immediately recognize that this is always a valid argument. So then all work we have left to do is to check to see if the argument is sound. Now let's look at the way the conditional reasoning can be done differently. If there is a fire, then the alarm will sound. The alarm has sound, therefore there is a fire. Now let's look at the returning back to our original conditional. If there is a fire, then the alarm will sound. So what's saying is, if there is a fire, that has to be the case that the alarm will sound. The alarm has sound, therefore there is a fire. So is there any situation we can think of where an alarm has sound, but there hasn't been a fire? We can think of many. It could be just a fire alarm drill. You could be having a shower too hot and the steam has set it off. You could have burnt your toast. It may have malfunctioned. There might be a mouse in the attic that might have set it off. There's all these different reasons why an alarm is sound, even though there isn't a fire. So this is an invalid argument. This form of argument is called affirming the consequent. And because it's an invalid form of argument, it's taught as a fallacy, which we covered last video. So when we look at the affirming the consequent in its logical form, is if P then Q, Q therefore P. So similar to when we're talking about the logical form of Modus Ponens, we're saying if P is the case, then Q has to be the case. Q is the case, therefore P has to be the case. But as we've established, this is an invalid argument, and it's always invalid, since we know it doesn't matter what we put in the P and the Q. It's always going to be a possibility that P might not be the case, even though Q is the case. So this, when you see logical structures in these kind of arguments, then you know immediately the argument is invalid. Now moving on to the next style of a conditional argument. If there is a fire, then the alarm will sound. The alarm has not sound, therefore there is no fire. Now, when we go back to our conditional, once again, if there is a fire, then it has to be the case that the alarm will sound. So if it has to be the case that the alarm will sound if there is a fire, and the alarm has not sounded, then it would have to be the case that there is no fire, because it's something that has to occur if something else has occurred. So if an alarm sounding has to occur if there is a fire, and the alarm has not sounded, that has to be the case that there is no fire. So this is a valid argument. The argument of this style is called Modus Tollens. So looking at the logical form of Modus Tollens, if P then Q, not Q, therefore not P, is saying that if P is the case, then Q has to be the case. And since we know that Q is not the case, it tells us that it has to be the case that P is also not the case. So this is always a valid argument structure. So when you see this structure of if something is the case, then something else has to be the case, that something else is not the case, so it tells us that the original thing is also not the case. So this is Modus Tollens, and it is always valid. Moving on to our last form of conditional reasoning. If there is a fire, then the alarm will sound. There is no fire, therefore the alarm will not sound. Now, once again, we just established with our conditional, if there is a fire, then it has to be the case that the alarm will sound. Now, there not being a fire, does that mean it would have to be the case that the alarm will not sound? Now, when we're going through the problems of affirming the consequent, similar counterexamples can show that this is not the case. The alarm could sound due to a malfunction, or a mouse in the attic, or a too hot shower, or burning your toast, and so on. So even though it could be true that there's no fire, and it's also true that if there was a fire, that the alarm would sound, it doesn't mean that it would have to be the case that the alarm will not sound. So this is an invalid argument. They call this denying the antecedent. So the logical form of denying the antecedent looks like this. If P, then Q, not P, therefore not Q. And as we've established in the previous example, if P is the case, then Q has to be the case. Just establishing that it's not that P is not the case does not mean that's necessarily true that Q is also not the case. So this logical structure is always invalid. So when we recognize this logical structure in an argument, we'll immediately know that it's invalid. So as we know, to check whether a particular argument is sound, we need to know whether all the premises are true. So when we're trying to check for a conditional whether it's true or false, the rules are very similar to when we're checking an argument is valid. So we're trying to check that if P is the case, then Q also has to be the case. So if we can think of any example where P could be true, but Q could be false, then we are saying that the conditional if P then Q is false. For instance, saying if there is a fire, then the alarm will sound. We can reject that conditional by saying that there could be a case where, say, the batteries have gone flat, or once again a malfunction which causes it not to sound when there is a fire. So we can show these examples to reject the conditional if there is a fire, then the alarm will sound. There's a little bit of controversy amongst philosophers on what standard we have to hold. Some will say that as if there's any possibility at all, then we can reject if P then Q. Others will say that if we can rule enough of them out, then we can accept the conditional of if P then Q. I tend to hold the position of if you can rule out those counterexamples, then you can accept if P then Q. For instance, with the if there is a fire, then the alarm will sound, and then you offer the counter example of the batteries have gone flat. And we can retort by saying, well, no, the particular one we've got at the house is a beeper, which starts to warn you if it's going flat, and it wasn't beeping this morning, so that's that's not the case. And with malfunctioning, say we could say maybe the fire department checked it a couple of days ago and it all was fine. You can think that you can set your own standard there on accepting if P then Q as a premise. But that's a bit of the controversy there. I hold the view that if you can rule out any example that you can think which would show if P then Q to be false, then you can accept if P then Q as true. So that's the standard there. But if you look at some other literature, you might find some other arguments surrounding that, and then you can make your own decision regarding that. If you want more information, you can go onto the website www.philosophycriticalthinking.com, or you can purchase the book Understanding Arguments by Walter St. Armstrong and Robert Fogelin, which is in the description below or on the website. Our next video is going to be concerning arguments involving terms such as all, only, none, and some, which is called categorical syllogisms. We will be going over styles of that nature regarding arguments. If you want to stay in tune for those tutorials, please subscribe and click the bell. Thanks.